funny thing about human memory is that it is really short term most of the time. It used to be that you could make an offensive joke at 16, say something ignorant in college, or even post a regrettable opinion online. And with enough time, people would simply forget. Because that's how human memory works. We move on, we let go. But the internet doesn't work that way. Because the internet remembers everything. In 2018, director James Gunn was fired from Guardians of the Galaxy 3 after tweets from a decade earlier resurfaced. Now, these were really offensive tweets that he had posted between 2008 and 2012. He apologized, explaining that he had viewed himself as a provocateur back then, making outrageous jokes for shock value, and that he'd grown up, developed as a person, and changed his approach to humor. But the tweets remained, preserved perfectly in the digital archive. And Disney fired him for it. The question that that case, and many others, raises cuts deeper than celebrity scandals. If someone says something offensive at 16, and they can never outgrow it because the internet preserves it forever, what does that mean for personal growth? Does personal change mean anything if society will not let you demonstrate it? And where exactly is the line between holding people accountable for their actions and allowing room for redemption? So let's start with what makes digital permanence different from anything humans have actually dealt with before. Historically, youthful mistakes came with what researchers call a moratorium on consequences. Meaning, you can be an idiot at 17 and cringe about it at 25. And by 35, most people have forgotten the details. And this was psychologically necessary. Kate Eichhorn, who researches youth and media, points out that we are hardwired to forget difficult or traumatic memories as a way to move past them. Forgetting allows us to reinvent ourselves, to try on different identities, and to grow beyond what we used to be. But digital natives have grown up under constant documentation. Every bad joke, every poorly thought out opinion, and embarrassing moment gets captured and stored, even if someone isn't posting those embarrassing things themselves. You never know when you are being recorded. And even if you delete something, it can be archived, screenshot, and shared by others, because the data is still there. And for young people especially, this creates a serious problem. The very time in life when you are supposed to be figuring out who you are, experimenting with ideas, and making mistakes from learning from them, is now permanently recorded. The exploratory phase of youth has become evidence that can be used against you later. The European Union tried to address this with the General Data Protection Regulations, right to erasure, often called the right to be forgotten. The idea is that individuals should be able to request deletion of personal data that is no longer relevant or necessary. And it came out of a 2014 case where a Spanish man wanted Google to remove links to an old newspaper article about his debt problems. The court agreed. The information was outdated, and it continued to harm his reputation unfairly. But this is where it gets philosophically interesting. The right to be forgotten isn't actually about forgetting. It's about something much deeper. The question of whether people can genuinely change and whether society should recognize that change. So let's think about personal identity for just a moment. What makes you the same person that you were 10 years ago? Philosophers have wrestled with this question for centuries. Your body has changed, most of your cells have been replaced, your beliefs have probably shifted, your values might be different, and you've had experiences that have shaped you in ways that you could not have predicted. So, in what sense are you still you? One answer comes from narrative identity theory. This view says that what makes us who we are is a story that we tell ourselves. We are not static beings with some unchanging essence in our core. We are ongoing narratives, constantly being written and rewritten. We look at our past actions, our relationships, our choices, and we construct a coherent story that explains how we got from there to here. But narratives require the ability to move forward, just like a novel. A character who makes a terrible mistake in chapter 5 is not frozen in that moment forever, because the rest of the book shows how they deal with the consequences, how they grow, how they become someone different by chapter 20. The mistake becomes part of a larger arc about transformation and redemption. Without that possibility of development, you don't have a story. You just have a permanent record of the worst thing that someone ever did. Digital performance threatens this narrative structure of identity. When your 16-year-old self's offensive tweet is always readily available, always the first thing that shows up when someone searches your name, it's like being stuck in chapter 5 forever. You can't write the rest of the story. You can't demonstrate growth, because the past becomes an anchor that prevents moving forward. Philosophers who study personal identity distinguish between numerical identity and psychological continuity. Numerical identity is about whether you are literally the same entity over time. Psychological continuity is about whether there is an overlapping chain of psychological connections between your past and your present self. Your memories, beliefs, desires, personality traits are all flowing from one moment into the next. Derek Parfait argued that what matters in survival is not identity, but psychological continuity. You could imagine a person so dramatically transformed by time and experience that they share almost nothing psychologically with their former self. Are they really the same person? In a deep sense, maybe not. The person who posted that offensive tweet at 16 might be psychologically discontinuous with the 30-year-old professional trying to move past it. They remember making the mistake, but they don't share the same beliefs and values and the sense of humor that led to it. The psychological chain has been broken. And this brings us to the tension between accountability and grace. On one hand, people should be held accountable for their actions. If you said something racist, sexist, or otherwise harmful, pretending that it never happened doesn't actually help you. The people that you hurt don't benefit from selective amnesia. Justice requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing. But on the other hand, the whole point of moral responsibility is that people can change. If we believe humans are capable of moral development, of learning from mistakes and becoming better, then we have to allow room for that transformation. Permanent punishment kind of defeats the whole purpose of being a human. It removes any incentive for growth. Why bother changing if you'll be judged by your worst moment forever? The philosophical literature on forgiveness helps to clarify this tension. Forgiveness is not the same as excusing or forgetting something. When you excuse someone, you are saying that they weren't really responsible for what they did. When you forget, you are simply failing to hold them accountable. Forgiveness is different. It requires acknowledgement that wrong was done and that the person was responsible, and then a conscious choice to overcome resentment and move forward. The philosopher Geoffrey Murphy emphasized that forgiveness must be principled. You can't forgive for just any reason. True forgiveness happens when the wrongdoer has genuinely changed, and they recognize the harm they caused, and made amends that they can, and demonstrated through their actions that they are truly different. And that is simply recognizing their capacity for moral growth and responding to the person that they have become rather than the person that they were. Real change requires more than just saying you're sorry. It actually does require becoming someone else. The problem with digital performance is that it makes this transformation essentially invisible. You can genuinely change and develop new values, but the evidence of your past remains equally visible as the evidence of your present. There is no proportionality. A tweet from 2010 has the same presence in a Google search as your recent work demonstrating growth. The archive does not distinguish between who you were and who you are. Consider James Gunn's case again. After his initial firing, something really interesting happened. The entire Guardians cast publicly defended him. Chris Pratt, Zoe Saldana, Dave Bautista, and others signed an open letter arguing that while they did not defend his old jokes, they knew the person he had become. They had worked with him for years and seen his character. And crucially, Disney eventually rehired him. They recognized that the decade-old tweets did not represent who he was now. But that resolution required something most people don't have: a public platform and colleagues who are willing to vouch for them, and enough cultural capital that their story actually got heard. Most people whose old posts resurface don't get that chance. They get fired, rejected, and shut out of opportunities, with no mechanism to demonstrate that they have changed. And this creates a serious practical problem. If society offers no pathway to redemption, no way to prove that you've grown, then what happens? People who have made mistakes have no incentive to do better. Why work on yourself if you'll be judged by your worst moment regardless? And society loses out on the contributions of people who could have developed into thoughtful, mature adults if given the chance. But the distinction between cancel culture and consequence culture actually matter. Consequence culture says that actions have repercussions. If you say something harmful, you should face appropriate consequences, whether that's a loss of scholarships, criticism, or professional setbacks. The proportionality might make sense. The consequences have to fit the offense, though. Cancel culture, on the other hand, tends towards disproportionate permanent punishment. It's not structured around rehabilitation or growth, but it's essentially just banishment. And unlike legal systems that have frameworks for determining appropriate punishments and paths back into society, online cancellation is mob-driven and permanent for most people. There is no mechanism for demonstrating that you've changed or any way to have your case reconsidered in light of new evidence about who you've become. Many philosophers have pointed out that the emotion driving much of cancel culture is anger, which is morally unstable. It seeks payback rather than restoration. And because social media amplifies and accelerates these anger-driven responses, we end up with a system that is less about justice and more about public shaming. The speed and visibility of the internet turn accountability into spectacle. If we take seriously the idea that people can change, and that personal identity is constructed through ongoing narratives, and that moral development is possible and valuable, then we need social practices that allow for that redemption. Of course, this doesn't mean ignoring harm or pretending that mistakes don't matter. But it does mean creating space between holding people accountable and destroying their entire future. A stupid joke from high school should not carry the same weight as a pattern of harmful behavior continuing into adulthood, because context, age, and whether they have acknowledged the harm and demonstrated change actually matters. because growth takes time. If someone posted offensive content 5 years ago and has since educated themselves, apologized, and shown through their actions that they have changed, then that trajectory matters. We need to distinguish between someone frozen in their old beliefs and someone who has actually worked to become better. And we also need to acknowledge that growth. And this is where the right to be forgotten really becomes important. It's a way to ensure that old mistakes do not permanently overshadow evidence of change. When you search someone's name, maybe the results should reflect their recent work, rather than being dominated by their worst moment a decade ago. It ensures that, just like our legal system, the consequences are proportionate and that redemption remains possible. Because if we build a society where mistakes are permanent and growth is invisible, we are not creating a more just world. We're just creating a world where everyone lives in fear of their past and where young people cannot experiment with ideas because there is no room for error. Now, that doesn't mean that offensive things should not be taken seriously, but we should allow people to make changes for themselves. So, with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see y'all next time.